So today we are completing our brief sermon series in which we have skipped through just two of the New Testament letters that were written by Paul to individual people. And we're leaping to the final chapter of Paul's first epistle to Timothy, in which Paul promotes the notion that the followers of Jesus Christ should treasure generosity. We live in a world shaped by what has been described as the myth of scarcity, the narrative that there's not enough. In different ways, we're repeatedly given that message that our resources are limited, our reserves need building up. Our priority should be to hold on to what we've got and to save up, if possible, even more, because there's worse times coming. The rainy day needs to be prepared for. And this myth of scarcity causes many people to go way beyond careful prudence and sensible financial planning. It can twist hearts into knots of anxiety and defensiveness and even greed. This can be true over every type of resource: money, possessions, time, even love. And in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 6 to 19, the Apostle Paul is saying that this scarcity mindset isn't just cultural, it is also theological, it's spiritual. It's theological because how we relate to our stuff also reveals what we think God is like. And it's spiritual because how we relate to money and possessions and time and love reveals in what or in whom we are placing our faith. The basic message Paul seeks to convey, both to Timothy and to us, is that those who have been infected by the scarcity mentality, which causes them to hold with tight fists onto their money and possessions and their time and their love, have a warped view of God and are putting their faith in the wrong things. Instead of buying into the myth of scarcity, Paul says that we should be aiming for godliness with contentment. That English word, godliness, is a translation of the Greek word eusebeia, which means reverence towards God, practical piety, or a life lived in alignment with the divine will. So eusebeia conveys more than just being moral or religious. It is a comprehensive term for a life lived in honor of God, in thought, in action, in devotion. For Paul, this living in honor of God must be Christ-centered. Not in the sense of endlessly talking about Jesus Christ or talking about God, but in the sense of consciously trying to follow the example, the teaching of Jesus Christ. So when it comes to the resources of money, possessions, time, love, the example and teaching of Jesus Christ is totally opposed to the myth of scarcity. Jesus himself once summed up his approach like this. He said, "Freely you have received, so freely give." Freely you've been given everything. Freely give. In other words, be generous with the resources you have to hand. That is the practical expression of godliness that Paul is talking about. The English word contentment is a translation of the Greek word autarkia, which literally means a kind of inner sufficiency that is not dependent on our circumstances, our external circumstances. In Paul's teaching, autarkia is not about self-sufficiency in the worldly sense of self-help, but rather it's about God sufficiency in the sense of trusting that God will provide enough. This form of contentment is a freedom from anxiety and striving in which one's soul is resting in the provision and presence of God. And again, this is precisely what Jesus taught in his Sermon on the Mount. He put it like this: do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothes? Seek first God's kingdom and God's righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. Therefore, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. This is what those Greek words mean. This is eusebia with autarkia. This is life lived in alignment with the divine will, with God sufficiency. This is godliness with contentment. It's not complacency. It's not passivity. It is a deep trust in the God who's given us the gift of life and who provides. But for most of us, that's not a natural state. We're conditioned by our consumer society, by every advert we watch or read, to crave more. More stuff, more security, more comfort. But Paul is saying that when we pair a life orientated towards God with a heart that is at peace with what God provides, then we discover a far superior form of wealth, a more wonderful kind of treasure that no market can sell, that no thief will ever be able to steal. It's a liberation from the myth of scarcity that ever remembers how, as Paul puts it, we brought nothing into the world and we can take nothing out of it. In 1 Timothy 6 verse 10 we find one of the most famous and most misquoted verses of the Bible. Paul does not say money is the root of all evil. Lots of people think he did. But he didn't. What he actually says is the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. Money itself is not the problem. The root problem is the love or desire for more money. More money is desired because we're told it will make us feel safe. It'll give us a degree of control. It will give us a sense of power and agency. More money, more safety. More money, more control. More money, more power. More choice, more agency. And if we're infected with the myth of scarcity, we may well think that more money will fill the ache of the not enough that all those adverts try and plant within us. But Paul says this love of money, which may or may not result in the accumulation of material stuff, is in fact a harmful trap and snare. that often leads to foolishness and harm and even to ruin and destruction, he says. He says to Timothy and to us, some people, eager for money, have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. Paul is saying that the drive to acquire, to amass, to hoard, the impulse to store up treasures on earth, the desire for personal gain and resistance to being generous towards others as we might be, inflicts spiritual wounds on a person. Which is why Jesus said, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moths and vermin destroy, where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moths and vermin do not destroy, where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Some hear that particular teaching of Jesus and have assumed that Jesus is calling everybody to take a vow of poverty. But I think that interpretation makes no sense in the original context. It's clear from the Gospels, for example, that Jesus' earthly ministry was sustained with the help of wealthy and generous supporters. And likewise, whilst Paul is famous for being a tent maker trying to earn money to keep himself, his missionary journeys with him and his mission team also often relied on them being put up in the fancy homes of wealthy hosts who were generous to them. So the issue Jesus is addressing is not how much stuff you have, how much money you've got, but what you do with it. The measure is not what we gain. The measure is what we give. So Paul tells Timothy to command those who are rich in material things to do good, to be rich in good deeds, to be generous and willing to share, no matter the magnitude of their possessions. The life of a godly and contented person is marked out not by what they accumulate, but what they give. And I don't know about you, but some of the most generous people I've ever met don't actually have much, but from the little they have, they're generous. It's about holding what we have, not tightly in a clenched fist, but lightly with an open hand. Generosity is a kind of resistance against the myth of scarcity. It says, I believe in a God who provides. I do not need to hoard. I am free to give. And Paul says that when we live like this, we take hold of the life that is truly life. In June this year, the brilliant Old Testament scholar and theologian from America, Walter Brueggemann, died. He was 92 years old. He's left behind him libraries full of his works, phenomenal books. And Brueggemann would often, in his writings, seeks to summarize his reading of the scriptures, his theology, by writing poetic prayers. And in September 2002, he wrote a poem prayer called On Generosity. I've spoken of it before. And in that poem, I'm not going to read it all, but he starts by naming the default posture of many people of faith who've been infected by the myth of scarcity. He says this: on our own, we conclude there is not enough to go around. We should seize the day. We should seize our goods. We should seize our neighbour's goods, because there is not enough to go around. But then he shifts the lens into our fear of lack, says Brueggemann. God comes giving. Giving bread in the wilderness, giving homes to the exiles, giving joy to the dead, giving life we did not invent, giving us a future that is constantly gift upon gift. And he goes on, as we watch, as we receive, something changes. Brueggemann says, it dawns on us late rather than soon that you, O God, give food in due season. You open your hand and satisfy the desire of every living thing. This is the Easter economy, a world made new, not by grabbing and hoarding, but by grace and gift and generosity. A world, as Brueggemann puts it, made Easter new. So how do we live this out? What Paul teaches Timothy and teaches us suggests three things. First, we do it by practicing contentment. Daily, we name what we have and we give thanks for it. We resist the lie that we need more in order to be whole. Secondly, we practice generosity. We give not just when we've got what we perceive to be excess. We give from our trust in God. We unclench our fists and hold everything with an open hand. And we practice giving freely of our time, our money, our possessions, our love, our attention, our mercy. Then third, as well as practicing contentment, practicing generosity, we practice treasuring differently. We stop measuring the success of our day by how much we have gained. And we start measuring how much we gave. Do you know, we can even do that in our attitude to worship. If we go away from an act of worship and think, well, I didn't gain much from that, we've got the wrong attitude. We come to worship to give of our expression of love and praise to God, to give encouragement to our sisters and brothers. As we remember every time we share in the bread and wine, God has been so generous. So we are free to be generous too.